Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. I am not Matt Cloyd. I am here with Pastor Michael Estes, and this is the Ridgecrest podcast, where we look at this last week's sermon and we discuss it. We talk about it. We go deep into the details of what it means to listen to this sermon. Was that a pretty good intro?
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, who are you?
My name is Logan Elsie. I am the student pastor, and we're excited to be here. Hush up, Stephen.
Maybe the best introduction that we've ever had.
I thought it was good. I thought it was really good.
Matt's really solid, on point. That was wide open.
That's how I live, wide open.
I believe that.
Just
every moment.
Leaking fuel everywhere, wide open.
You know what that is?
So I wanted to start off because this was an interesting Sunday for lots of reasons. But it was your birthday.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, we're bringing this up. So how was your birthday?
It was good.
Okay.
Mostly because most places I went, people didn't make a big deal out of it, except for church.
For here.
No, it was a great day. We ate Mexican food. We spent the afternoon together, so it was good.
Did Micah do well?
Yes, they played pretty well. They ended up making it to a championship game.
Oh man,
they lost there. That happens.
Oh, that's a little depressing. But I wanted to bring that up because I need to apologize because I did if you weren't there on Sunday morning, I did the announcements and the welcome for the beginning, and during the second service, I kind of did a big hoopla about Michael's birthday.
Yep.
And it went great. I had to sing happy birthday. Greg made me do it. I'm sure it was okay.
You sang well.
But then thank you. But then at the end, because I was trying to move on to the next thing away from your birthday and
transitions are hard.
Transition, that's the word. I'm having a hard time transitioning through this transition. And I said the words, "Well, Michael, it's been a good run." And then immediately realized, no, that usually means either he's dead or he got fired.
Yep.
Neither of which I want to happen. And so then I had to try to backpedal. It didn't work. And then Greg ended up saying, "Hi, I made you sing on stage." And then I looked at Greg and said, "Hey, maybe I'll just take your job." And I was like, I've got to quit insulting everyone on stage, especially the people who are on staff.
You impressively almost ran both of us off on the same Sunday.
would have been something. But anyway, it was a good Sunday. How did you feel just overall about the sermon?
I felt like it was good. I've been really challenged by 1 Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest with you. In my preparation, it's a book that I've studied before, but not in this kind of depth. And it has been, in so many ways, I see parallels between our world and his world, and the believers in that world going through the things they are, and just kind of like what we're going through as a church right now. Generally speaking, like the church in COVID, having to rethink the concept of church is not primarily a location, but an identity. And there's so much of that in here, and it's just kind of been hammered home week after week after week. And then also the tie between, not only are we identified a particular way, but because we have been identified that way, we have to live a particular way. And making that connection between who we are and what we do. And sometimes that gets lost. Sometimes we like to think about, well, this is who we are, and that's all we focus on, but we never get to now how do we live that way. And I like that about 1 Peter.
Oh yeah,
very practical.
Well, good. So if someone's watching this and they weren't at church or they haven't listened to the sermon yet, can you give a 180 character tweet about what it was and maybe just the gist of it?
Yeah. So we were in 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12. If you want to go and look at it. And the first part of that, 9 and 10, are all about who we are. What does it mean to be a part of the body of Christ? Because if you go back earlier in the same chapter in verses 4 and 5, he talks about the fact that we're being built up into a spiritual house and that we are a holy priesthood and we offer spiritual sacrifice. All that's temple language. And so he wants us to understand ourselves in light of the history of Israel. And then he goes into this kind of full-on paragraph about description. So he calls us a chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, people for his own possession. So there's all these identifiers. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand who we are. And then the second part was verses 11 and 12 was all about, now this is the way we live. And we have to reject evil, but at the same time we have to live beautifully. Live honorably is the word that the ESV uses. And so there's the parallel between what we do and who we are and what we do. And then as we move through the rest of the chapter, and chapters that come after this, it's a lot of practical, like this is how you live now.
Yeah, which I think that's very important, and that's kind of the meat and potatoes to it. But if you don't have the foundation of,
Yeah.
you know, why should we be living this way, and like you said, who we are, then we kind of tend to get lost in the practicality of it. But so there's a couple things I wanted to talk about, but the first part is when I'm reading through that text, the phrase that always jumps out to me, and I feel like it jumps out just because of our culture and the differences between our culture and ancient Hebrew culture, is that holy priesthood. And so just take like as much time as you want to. It's your podcast, but just a quick thing on priesthood, holiness, why that fits in. I know you talked about temple language, but just what's the significance of that, especially today, since we as a Baptist church, we don't even have priests technically, and so that's really a foreign concept to us.
Yeah, we have a tendency to think of priest and think clergy, like these are the people that run the church, that sort of thing. There's a lot of that background of Catholicism in there, and even in other denominations that aren't Catholic. You have Anglicans and Episcopals that think in terms of priests, that sort of thing. So some of us come from those backgrounds, and so we have that kind of as context for what's going on. But in the Old Testament, the way I described it in the sermon was that the priests were the mediators of God's grace through the sacrificial system. So they didn't do anything to give grace to people, but they went through the process of sacrificing. So there was a process that God put in place, that he had a group of people that were serving the people, that they would sacrifice on behalf of the people. Well, one of the things that we've learned through the New Testament is that now we're all priests. And so we don't have to go through the mediating type of grace anymore. We can access grace freely, but we can also give it out to other people freely as well. And so when I thought about the priests in the Old Testament and kind of how that works for us, there were two things that came to mind. One was proximity to God's presence. The priests were in the temple and the tabernacle all the time. They were close to God's presence at all times. And
that was literally
Yeah.
because of the relationship between God's temple and the actual presence of God that resided there.
Right. And so they were physically close to God's presence in the same way as the priesthood of all believers kind of tells us we're all close to God's presence. The curtain that stood between mankind and God's presence in the temple. And if you want to go look at this, you can just go look in the Old Testament where it describes the temple, and one of the things that you'll see is that the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was cut off from the rest of the temple by a giant veil, a big curtain. And when Jesus died on the cross, that curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. And what that means, what that signifies for us, is that we now have free access to God's presence. And so, as a royal priesthood, a holy priesthood, we now have free access to God's presence at all times. And what that means is that we can go out and take that presence into the world. A way to kind of understand this, when Moses was in God's presence, and Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 3, he talks about how Moses' face was changed, but he had to wear a veil because the people were afraid. Well, in the same way, we have been changed by being close to God's presence, but we don't have to wear the veil. We can walk out into the world, and people can see a reflection of God's presence through our proximity to him. The other thing is that, and this goes to what I was just talking about, is that in the same way that the Old Testament priests were mediators of God's grace, in the same way we can mediate God's grace to people by sharing the gospel with them, by living a life that draws people to him. And so there's those parallels between this Old Testament priesthood and now us as the royal priesthood, this kingdom of servants that go out to the world and share God's presence and grace with people.
When I was in high school, the first time I ever heard about the temple at all is our pastor at the time was kind of explaining what the temple was and the different gates and the different areas, and it always freaked me out talking about when the high priest would have to go in the Holy of Holies and they tie the rope around his ankle. I was like, why is he doing that?
Yep.
And it was because if that joker dropped dead because he wasn't right with God, they had to drag that dude out.
Yep.
And it's crazy.
I always say that nobody would sign up for that job.
No, zero. It sounds great until you're standing in front of that door with some rope tied around you. It's like, good luck.
Yep.
But I think that's interesting because the proximity and how they're mediators, because, it's not just a vocation. It's not just supposed to be us. It's supposed to be the priesthood of all believers.
Yeah.
How we all have this role that we are supposed to fulfill, that we're supposed to be doing that work. And it's different for us because we feel a vocationary call to it. But if you're a janitor or a doctor or a crop duster, then you have that same role that you have to fill.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, and that's, Peter says you are a royal priesthood. He doesn't point to himself and say, I am a priest. Now I mediate God's grace to you. No, he says you are. And so that means that everybody who's a member of the body, that's your calling in life.
Right.
That's who you ultimately are. You can have a profession that may not be, a pastor or whatever, but ultimately we're all called to be that priesthood, that kingdom of servants. So.
And that's why I have a ton of respect, and I admire the people who work 40, 50-hour jobs a week, and they have families, and their kids play Little League and, do all these crazy things, and yet still they are fulfilling the role of that priest, that they're going and meeting with people, they're in church serving, they're out in the community loving people well and bringing God's kingdom closer.
Yeah.
We have dedicated our lives to it, but that also in a sense means that we have a lot more time to do it. And there's different roles, and we could get into what we do during the week, which nobody understands.
Yeah.
But I've always respected and admired those families and those people who say, even though I'm a stockbroker, even though I'm doing whatever, this is so important to me. This is the role that I have, that I've been called into, that I'm going to give my life to this, even though I have also other things on my plate.
Yeah.
I just think that's awesome.
I agree.
Another thing that I really liked when you were talking about is you had that blurb, and I'll tie it to the story where you tied allegiance to the Pledge of Allegiance in schools and all that stuff. I'm pretty sure I was part of that group that every single day you stood up in class, you pledge allegiance to the flag, you ran all the way through it. But I think that was a really good illustration because I think the word allegiance, especially in America, is almost solely tied to the Pledge of Allegiance without really understanding the epitome of it. So just kind of spend 30 seconds and walk through allegiance and kind of what that meant in the text.
Well, yeah, if you look at the reason I talked about allegiance is because he calls the church a holy, or the people of God a holy nation. And so that got me thinking in terms of we have a tendency to identify ourselves as I'm from here, so this is my home, this is my nation, and so I have allegiance to those things. And I thought it was important that we think about the concept of allegiance because, there was a time in my life where I started to think a lot about, okay, when I pledge allegiance to the flag, I'm saying something that's important, right?
Right.
I'm saying I agree with the concept of this nation, if nothing else, right? I think people take it much further than that, and they say, I agree with all that this nation does, or, every part of our history or whatever. And I started to question about, okay, do I as a follower of Christ want to have that sort of allegiance to something that's human, that's, man-made?
Right.
And obviously I believe in God's sovereignty and setting up nations and tearing them down, those sorts of things. That's definitely a real reoccurring theme in the scriptures. But I want to make sure that I am lining my values, my understanding of the world up with the way God sees it, and not just simply saying, well, I'm attaching God to a bunch of other beliefs that I also hold. And so I had to reevaluate, what does allegiance mean to me, and how can I best understand it biblically?
Yeah.
So for me, when I try to figure that out and determine, who gets it, I think about a couple things. I think about, what do I prioritize in life? And where should that be set up? What comes first? Who comes first? Those sorts of things. And that immediately makes me think of, a passage like Matthew 6, where Jesus says that if we seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, all those things that we have a tendency to worry about and think about, security and my needs being met and those sorts of things, all those things will be added to me. And so I don't have to worry about those things because ultimately my allegiance is to God and he'll care for me. Even if that means that I don't have everything that I want all the time. Even sometimes I won't have the things that I need in the sense of on an earthly level. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, God is going to be the one that takes care of me because he's the one I've pledged allegiance to ultimately.
Right. And at first, when I'm thinking through this, and I think through Peter's original audience and us today, at first I feel like there's a big difference between us and them because, I mean, they were under an empire. I mean, there was Caesar ruled with an iron fist. It was what he said goes. I mean, it's literally how they ran the show as they took over. But then I think about allegiance, and I think about who we are today, especially where we're located in the south of America. Not South America, but in the southern part.
Yeah.
It's just I would say it's a very patriotic area.
It is, yeah.
And we're rolling into one of the most important dates of being an American is Election Day. And there's a lot of people who tie so strongly to America. They tie so strongly to this is where I am. I'm American. It's my identity. It's who I am. And we get so caught up in that. And when I think about that allegiance of what we're tied to and who we are, I think it's important to figure out, when Peter and Paul and everybody would talk about like Jesus is your Lord above all else. Like give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but the Lord of your life is Christ. Yeah. I think it's an important distinction to make, especially when we're going into such a tumultuous time as a country. And then you even talked about like, you were talking about the British Empire and the Roman Empire, but people thought that would last for eternity. Yeah. Like Rome would never fall. And like Britain was going to be the king of everything. Yep. And and I have a feeling that we feel the same way about America, and we don't know how long this will last. We don't know what the future holds at all, but we do know that God is the same forever.
Yeah, and I don't think by doing that we take a negative view of the place that we live. I think we take a realistic view. That's one of the things that being a believer is really like has impacted me in so many ways, is that I can take a realistic view of the world. Like I don't have to buy into a particular narrative. I've got the narrative.
Right.
And so, yes, I'm grateful. I've been to other countries before. I'm grateful that I live in the United States of America for a lot of reasons. But if God decided to destroy the empire that is America, if he decided that it no longer needed to be, the supreme power in the world, my life is going to go on because God is sovereign, and because the way I've gotten it from N.T. Wright and from some other Christian thinkers, Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. The New Testament writers understood that. They weren't going to freak out when Rome fell. You go back to all the way when Rome falls. Augustine writes this big work called The City of God, and he sets up these. He's like, listen, there's a city of man that is good in so many ways, but flawed in so many ways because it's created by man, it's run by man, and it's sinful and broken and that sort of thing. And then there's the city of God, the eternal city. And this is going to stand forever. The places where this lines up with this eternal city, the city of man lines up with the city of God, those are the places that we hold on to. But the places that it doesn't, we reject those things. We let those things go. And we're okay when they fade away.
So if I'm assuming that most of the people listening to this are Americans, they're probably from our community of people. But if you're not, in the context of being an American and being a believer, what's the balance between being an American and pledging allegiance to the flag, but also saying and exclaiming that Christ is our Savior? And how do we know if that gets out of whack?
Yeah, I think we can ask ourselves some questions. That's the way I like to process through things, is I like to ask a lot of questions. And so the questions that I would ask is, what makes me anxious? What discourages me? When am I hopeless? And, we're talking about the election. If the candidate that I vote for doesn't get elected, does that make me anxious? Why does it make me anxious? Now, there's a difference between that and apathy. Like, it's really easy to fall into the trap of, the candidate that I wanted to get elected didn't, so I don't care anymore.
Right.
You can still care without being anxious. But you also can always take the realistic view of God is sovereign. I don't have to be afraid in this situation. I don't have to worry in this situation. I don't have to be completely hopeless in this situation, because that candidate was never going to set up the kingdom of God on earth. As much as and even good Christian men or women that run for office and that get voted in, we shouldn't expect them to set up the kingdom of God on this planet. Like, we as individual believers bring the kingdom of God into our communities, and we shouldn't expect somebody that we vote into Washington or even into just our state, legislature, to all of a sudden be the one that fixes everything. That's our job. I think that idea that if we just vote the right way, that's going to fix everything. I think that's a way of us pushing responsibility off of ourselves and onto others if we're not careful. So, I think that's a way to understand allegiance as far as like on a national level. But like you can do this financially. You can pledge allegiance to your bank account, and you can do that. And the way you can check yourself is if things don't go well in the stock market or with your job or whatever, are you completely defeated by those things? Are you completely discouraged when that happens? Have you lost hope? And what that does is it tells us if you lose hope in that situation, it tells us all of a sudden that you have placed hope in something that wasn't intended for that. And so we create an idol that shouldn't exist. And we have to tear those things down. Painful as it may be, we have to. And ultimately, it's for our good when we do that.
Right. And you talked about apathy. I think it's interesting, and I feel like a lot of us are going to fall into that, or some of us may fall into it, because you put yourself so forward, like you devote so much of yourself to this one thing. In the case of an election, like there's many people whose whole lives are hanging in the balance of what happens on November, and then if it doesn't go your way, and this can be even small things, like you put a lot of effort into something, and if it doesn't work out, you get hurt, and you're like, wow, it's because I gave so much and I cared so much that now I'm hurting, so I'm just not going to care anymore.
Yeah, it's better than being in pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like I'd rather just feel nothing than feel negative emotions.
Yeah.
Why is that so dangerous, and how do we not fall into that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, first I think it's by acknowledging like why it is that apathy is. Why does it happen in the church, for example, like, and not just individually, but like in a general sense, how does apathy happen in a church? Well, I think there are three things that we can think about. I think, first of all, there's the reality of spiritual warfare, right? We are, Peter makes it really clear, we are to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against our soul. Like we're constantly in a battle.
Yep.
And we may not think of apathy as a sin, but I think it can lead to sinful things because we're not called to not care. We're called to actively care for and seek the good of people around us. That's not apathy. And so when that would be like what we would call a sin of omission. Like I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to care for the good for other people. I'm not going to seek their good because it's painful when I put myself out there and they don't respond the way I want them to. So there is the reality of spiritual warfare. I think there's also the danger of comfort. Like the scriptures, it happens all the time in the Old Testament. When Israel gets comfortable, what happens?
Not good things.
Right. All kinds of idolatry, all kinds of wandering off into sinful behaviors, and they start to think to themselves, "Oh, we did all this. Like
right.
we're responsible for all the good things that have happened in our life. We're responsible for, our successes." And there's this sense in which they just quit caring about their worship of God. Somebody brought up this past week, talked about Malachi, and I was reading. Yeah, that's what it was. I was reading Francis Chan's book, Letters to the Churches. He brings up the passage in Malachi where God's like, "I hate your worship," and they're like, "Well, why?" And you basically said, "This is wearisome to me. Like I don't want to do this anymore. I'm worn out from the ritual of this." And they'd gotten so comfortable with this thing that had become trivial to them. It didn't matter to them anymore. And so when we get comfortable, by the way, in our area, that's really easy to do.
Yep.
We live in a very affluent area. It doesn't mean everybody that attends a church at Ridgecrest or in our area is affluent, but it can be this trap that we fall into. Well, I mean, I'm pretty much taken care of. My bank account is comfortable. We have groceries each week. We live in a place that's safe, and so we can easily fall into that comfort trap. And
you ask questions like, "Why do I even need God?"
Right.
I mean, God, I pay my bills, I provide food, and I provide security. If you go down the hierarchy of needs, I do all those things for myself. Why do I need you?
Right. And it's a very gradual thing. I don't think it happens very quickly. I don't think all of a sudden, like one day we wake up and we're like, I don't need God anymore. But I think it's one of those things where we let ourselves fall into the trap. Well, I'm responsible for this, and I've done this, and I've done that, and before too long, we do bump into that place where we're like, I don't really need God anymore. In fact, I'd rather worship college football or
easy now, easy.
Hey, we don't have to worry about that in Mississippi. We don't. There's no reason for us to do that. We're terrible.
Yeah.
Now, Alabama fans, on the other hand, we have to pray for them.
Absolutely.
So, or Clemson fans now. I guess they're pretty good, but nobody here is a Clemson fan.
I heard about that score.
It's pretty
Holy
bad.
smokes.
So, but yeah, we can easily because we get comfortable, we can get in that trap, and it happens in all kinds of ways. The third thing is the failing of incomplete obedience. There's a lot of times where we start down the right road and we begin to be obedient, and then we just stop. And I was thinking about Judges, the book of Judges, not like Supreme Court judges. That's a big deal
That's
now.
a hot button topic
Yeah.
too. We are covering all the bases today.
All of them. That's what we do here. But no, in the book of Judges, early on, the author kind of points out, like, listen, part of the reason that we're going to go through all these things in this book is because the people didn't drive the Canaanites out.
Right.
They let them stay.
Yep.
And God had told them, listen, you got to drive all these people out, because if you don't, there's going to be consequences. And the consequences are this: your children and your children's children are going to start following after their gods. They're going to start marrying into these families that are going to worship these other gods. And so you're going to end up with a bunch of idolaters in the nation because you've allowed them to stay.
Right.
Well, what did they do? They started to drive them out, and then they were like compromising on this issue or that issue. And eventually they're there with the Canaanites, and the Canaanites lead them off into false worship, and there's all kinds of problems that happen. The cycle happens over and over and over in Judges. And so, there's a sense in which, like, when we start talking about some of the things that he's going to talk about in 1 Peter, where he starts talking about abstaining from the passions of the flesh and then keeping your conduct honorable, this is something that happens throughout life. It's not something that you do for a little while and you stop doing. And so, like, we have to be careful of falling into this pattern of incomplete obedience, where we start well, but we just don't finish. And God's called us to do both.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this, my thought went to Judges. And if you don't know, the book of Judges is it's literally cyclical about how God will bless his people, but then they'll fall away in the next generation. So God disciplines them, usually by them getting conquered by somebody. Yep. Then they cry out to God because they're in a rough spot. Then God sends a judge. And then the judge works through God, and God ends up blessing them again. And it happens over and over and over again. And so when you read it, you can read that. You could read 1st and 2nd Kings, the Chronicles. And I think those are really good books to see this, is because it covers so many generations over such a short amount of time. And you can read that and you're like, man, why are they so stupid? Like, they just keep disobeying. And like, just remember, like, God did all these crazy things. Like, he sent a judge which killed thousands of people with the jawbone.
Right.
Like, why do you not remember this? But then, when you turn around and you look at yourself, it's like, how long have I gone without even talking to God or even thinking about God? Because I've been so busy. Work has been crazy. There's all kinds of soccer tournaments and baseball tournaments happening, and things just get crazy, and we just forget. And we forget week to week. Think about what it would be like generation after generation. Yeah. I mean, and I think we just get to the point where we just lose it. We lose sight, we lose focus, and we forget. And
it becomes something that doesn't matter as much anymore. And so we just feel that apathy. So, yeah, definitely.
Well, kind of moving towards the end of this thing, I think my favorite part of what you talked about on Sunday was living beautifully. I think the way that I look at it and I think about this text is Peter is just hammering identity, who you are, whose you are, the things that God has placed on you as a believer, and the ways that he has gifted you, and the titles that we have. And it's almost like he's saying, you see who you are, you see what God has given you, now go and live beautifully. I love the wording of that. I love the picture it paints. Just, you talked about it on Sunday, but just what does it mean for a believer to live beautifully?
Yeah. I listed out a couple of things. I'll read those again really quickly. I listed them out as opposites. So I said that, I asked the question, what does a beautiful life look like? And I don't know that I'm going to have everything, but basically a beautiful life is going to have things like gratitude, forgiveness, hope, grace, love. And it's not going to have the opposites of those things. So like if you have gratitude, you're not going to be a complaining person. If your life is full of gratitude, you're not going to focus on the negative parts of life, the things that you don't have. If you have forgiveness, if you've really experienced forgiveness in your life, you're going to be willing to give it to other people because you've been freed from, that shame or that difficulty that you've gone through, and so you're not going to be bitter with others. You're not going to hold grudges with other people. If you have hope in your life, you're not going to deal with anxiety as much. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect in all these areas, but what it does, like I think so many people look at the Christian faith as a super negative thing. This is a group of people that don't get to do this and don't get to do that. And like, there's a part of me that wonders, like, do all these people see us as completely miserable?
Right.
And the truth of the matter is that is not the picture that's painted in Scripture at all. These are people that are in the midst of incredible difficulties. I mean, you think about the people in 1 Peter, he's writing to people that are literally exiled from their homelands. They're living in places that they didn't want to live. They were forced to move there by the government. Imagine for a second, all of a sudden, that the government says, you can't live in your house anymore. I'm going to send you out into this wilderness area. You got to go live there, away from your family, away from what you're used to. They're going to speak a different language. You're going to have a completely different culture. You got to live there now.
Right.
And not for any good reason. You didn't do anything wrong. You just had to. They didn't want you to live where you were living anymore. I don't know too many people that are going to respond to that with things like gratitude and hope and forgiveness. They're going to respond to that with things like complaining and bitterness and anxiety. How crazy would that look if a group of people, instead of responding with those negative qualities, instead responded with those virtues that God lays out for us of gratitude and forgiveness and hope? I mean, that it sends the world a really clear message that, like, home is not here.
Oh, hold on now.
So
We're gonna start preaching over here.
Yep. It'll happen occasionally. I just kind of fall into that mode every now and then.
But we're in student ministry. It's all over the Bible because we're walking through Daniel, and we're at Daniel 1. We talked about last week, and literally Nebuchadnezzar with Babylon takes over Jerusalem and just pulls some of the noble children out and takes them to Babylon. And so Daniel, this kid who has grown up with everything, we assume because he's nobility or even royalty, has had everything in life, and he gets literally plucked out, marched across the world to Babylon, and is told, like, I'm going to raise you with Babylonian culture, you're going to eat Babylonian food, and this is what your life's going to look like now.
Going to change your name.
Yeah.
Everything.
We're going to take your identity, which is your name in Hebrew culture, and we're going to completely turn it on its head. And you're going to be a new person who's been raised completely differently. And Daniel and his three buddies completely flip the script, and they say, we're going to continue, even though we're not in God's land, so to speak, we're going to continue, he's going to continue to be our God, and we're going to continue to be his people. I mean, it's all over the place. You see in Acts the way that people endured with all joy and worship in all things. So you named off a lot of these, the negatives, the opposites. Which one of those do you struggle with? What's the one when you read it, you're like, ugh. If you need to think, I have one that just hit me in the face. If you need to think on it.
I think I have one that I know that in the past I've struggled with. I think I'm really growing in this particular area. Is the area of hope. I think that there have been times in my life where I really struggled with, like how that concept works out and what it looks like, and having a realistic view of the world while at the same time looking at the world through God's perspective and seeing that hope doesn't mean that everything's going to be right now. It means that I can look forward to whatever it's going to be, because ultimately it's going to lead to something that God does. And it's going to be redeemed by the second coming of Jesus. And so, I think that's probably the area, and that that explains why I've struggled with anxiety at times.
Right.
But thankfully, God has really worked on that area in my life. I'm not perfect in any way, shape, or form. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. But that's
I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a second.
So, what about you?
Bitterness. And that was something that was like, if you'd have asked me before, like, do you struggle with bitterness? I probably wouldn't have said yes. But when you said just the word bitterness and how you oppose that with forgiveness, right? I was just thinking, it was like, I can have mercy. And I think I have a spiritual gifting of mercy. It's not my top gift, but like I feel that in my life. But at the same time, forgiveness can sometimes be an issue for me, especially if I've been slighted. If there's been like active things done against me or to oppose me, and whether that is intentional or unintentional, I can a lot of times deal with bitterness. And as you know, bitterness can just kind of just root in you, and it's something where you don't feel it. It's something where all of a sudden one day you're just been poisoned from it, and you're like, why do I still feel this way? Like, it's been months. Like, when I think about this person, like, I want to push them through a wall.
Yeah.
And I think when you live in forgiveness, I've had moments where people have shown me tremendous mercy and tremendous forgiveness for what I've done, and it's just a feeling that you don't get places. It's like when you're completely vulnerable, you just lay it all out, and then they say, I completely see it. You're not hiding anything from me. Like, I see all of you, and it's not pretty.
Yeah.
But I forgive you for that.
Yeah.
And like, we are still going to move forward in this. It's almost a physical, visceral feeling that I get of the weight being lifted off and the lightness from that. And it's something that, like, once you feel that, you just don't want to feel that way anymore.
Yeah.
Once that bitterness has been taken out of you, even if it's just a little bit, you don't want to be that way anymore. And I get a picture of grace from the opposite of that, from forgiveness. And so still something I deal with, but it's something that I actually like legitimately fight to forgive and live in forgiveness rather than bitterness with people.
I think it's important that you bring up the idea of fighting, because you do have to fight for these things. Like,
Yeah.
this is not, I mentioned, this is not natural for us as human beings. Our natural bent is to be selfish and to be envious of others and to, seek to be better than others and those sorts of things. And it's a supernatural work of God that we have to fight for too, that we're involved in that part of that work. And it's important for us to remember that and to fight for that, to fight to live in forgiveness, to fight to live in gratitude, and to reshape the way we think about everything. So,
Man,
it's good stuff.
I feel like I just poured myself out for you on this hosting thing.
It's really good. It's really good.
So
Take a nap later?
Maybe. We'll see what happens. Last thing, as we wrap up, talking about who we are, how we should be, how we should live, and living beautifully. For someone listening to this who is just, give it to me straight, give me something practical, what is one thing that the average believer can do this week to live beautifully? I know you've talked about a lot of different things, but just like walk someone's dog, give someone your lunch money. What is a practical thing we can do to live beautifully?
I think one of the things that's most impactful, and I know some people really don't like that word. I've talked to some English majors that really don't like the word impactful. It may, I don't know why that popped in my head, but I like the word. Anyway,
apparently they've never been impacted then.
Yeah, I guess not. But I think one thing that you can do that's very tangible and I mean, just pretty straightforward is to actively seek to be kind to somebody. And that can be things like, you have a neighbor that's kind of a shut-in, that they have a dog that needs to be walked. You know that. You can do that for them. Or it can be simply like taking the time to have a conversation with somebody that just looks like they're not themselves right now, or to just ask somebody a question like, how are you doing, and actually expect an answer. I got really convicted about this one time. I have a tendency to use how you doing as a hello and just keep on walking. And I've really grown in that particular area because, like, that's an area where, like, if I ask how you're doing, I need to be able to stop and listen.
Right.
Because if you need to tell me something, I need to be available for that. So, like, those are, like, really tangible things that we can do to live beautifully and to allow people, and a lot of times it's small things that we do that really make a big difference, because what that shows is that if we can manage to help in small ways, people will be willing to trust us in big things. And so I think that's a good way to approach it, is to look for small actions that are just, like, kind. Not nice, not polite. That's a Southern thing to do, but actually actively kind toward other people.
And I think if we can do that, we start to combat against the perceptions of, why is this church just full of angry, apathetic people? Instead, it looks at a place like, this is a group of people who are not perfect, but they love really well.
Yeah.
And even if that just means they're just really nice to me. But that was good. I like it. Anything else that you just wanted to throw on the end, add to?
Yeah. So the way we typically close things out is if anybody that's listening has a question about like spiritual things, if they want to know about having a relationship with Jesus or about how they might be able to join us here at Ridgecrest and seeking to be kind to the world, to live beautifully in this world that we live in, we want to help you do that as a church staff. You know, if you have a student that needs a place to connect, and Logan can help you out with that. If you, he plugging that student ministry. You know, we can connect you with Stacy Albritton, who does our children's stuff. If you want to serve on a worship team, maybe we have Greg. We have people that can help you fit here at Ridgecrest, and so we want to offer. If you have any questions about any of that, please contact us at the church. You can email us. You can make a phone call. Whatever you feel most comfortable with. We want you to reach out. We want you to know Jesus. We want you to be able to serve. We want you to be able to reach the world with the gospel. And so, thank you so much for listening today. And if you have any questions, please reach out.
Yeah, and don't forget that if you're not local, you can leave a comment if you're watching the video, either on YouTube or Facebook. If you're listening to this as a podcast, you can leave us a review or just go to our website and send us anything. We'd love to talk to you, even if you're not part of our local congregation or community. We'd love to talk to you. Other than that, we're going to wrap this puppy up. We'll see you later.